resolve those contradictions. We are here to play in that realm of contradiction and cognitive dissonance. We are here to infect your mind.
So you said you were looking
All
at
right.
attachment stuff? What do you mean by attachment stuff?
Yeah, it's kind of an old theory, but it's still kind of relevant today. And the idea of the attachment theory was this is how a parent parents their baby to develop them into like a normal person when they grow up versus like a crazy person who gets divorced 7 times and like, has all these social issues. And there's 4 different types. And there's a lot of evidence that it's pretty easy to develop like the good type, which is secure attachment. It's just like what you need to do, and everyone's a little different. So I spent most of my time looking at that stuff to kind of refamiliarize myself because it is not something I pay attention to in my day to day.
No, but that, to some degree, that is something that I do think about from time to time, is by definition, attachment to things sets us up for emotional distress. Nothing's permanent. If we attach ourselves to something, we apply emotional valence to that thing. And so any change in that relationship is going to cause distress. It's going to cause disorder.
Well, the like secure attachment style, the idea is that if the mom puts the baby in a room and leaves, the baby is pretty sure that she will come back if I cry, and she will come back when I need something, and she'll come back in general. So they're not freaked out by being left alone in a room. And a baby that doesn't have secure attachment will either flip out or do nothing or act really strangely, like do like repetitive movements, because they cannot trust that their needs will be met by their mother, which is the like insecure attachment. So there are, as a bit like the ones that like turn out, the only studies I've seen look at like 3-year-olds. So I've never seen a study that looks at attachment style from birth all the way to adulthood, just because the logistics of that are pretty unethical. Like saying like you have an insecure attachment, so I'm going to find out if you end up a criminal or whatever. There's just no way to do it where you can do it like double blind in that way. And then you can't really do studies of kids for 18 years because you lose all of them, or they move, or they withdraw consent. And so the logistics of that are difficult, but they can get about a year usually out of these studies. And they find that the secure attached infants have better outcomes as a 2-year-old than they did as a 1-year-old. So who's to say?
Yeah, well, a couple things about that. First of all, I assume that secure attachment as a metric for stable adulthood is because that individual has practiced healthy regulation and coping skills.
Mhm.
Right? Because it's really easy to slip into an anxiety attack with something like that, right? Because literally anything could happen. I ask my students this from time to time just to get them to think too much. If we were in a room, all of the windows closed or no windows at all of the doors closed and sealed, no cell phones, no communication into or out of the room. There's no way to see in or out, or right. Without opening doors and without going in and out of the room, how can you prove to me that anything outside of that room exists? You can't. You have to interact with what's outside of the room in order to demonstrate that what's outside of the room exists. You can have the memory of like coming into the room or whatever, but you can't prove to me that that memory is anything more than a memory without going out and interacting with the thing. So I can see from like the child's perspective in those studies that once mom leaves the room and the door closes, literally anything could be happening to her. She could be an angel spirit floating away. She could dissolve into nothingness. Like, who knows, right? So as long as you can emotionally regulate enough to quell those, then I see that that's healthy. The second thing that made me think about was the way you described that was a very clear, like, resolving conflict in like in Erickson's psychosocial development stage, right? For the really young. And it got me thinking, I wonder if one could find an underlying thread between all of Erickson's stages of psychosocial development dealing with attachment in some way, shape, or form.
I'm sure. But I think people really overcomplicate the attachment styles, because today, if you find someone who's interested in attachment styles, it is treated almost the same as astrology, where they're like, where were you born? Or like, I can tell that you're this because you did that one thing. And so it has fully gone into like pseudoscience, like, the Myers-Briggs personality types that mean nothing for what how you behave and how successful you are. And so I would be dubious of going too much into it, because the bottom line of the attachment research is that the only thing you have to do to build a secure attachment with an infant is to hold them, this as an example, hold them like this until they stop crying. And that is the only thing that they found across like every single study, that this is the thing that, and they're all looking at mothers, but any caregiver, holding them like this, if you put them down while they're still crying, that could build insecure attachment. If you don't ever pick them up, if you hold them like this when they're crying, that could make an insecure attachment. And so like, that's all it takes, which is what every mom already does, but apparently not all of them. So there's lots of other things you can do, like, having the bottle when they're hungry, and making sure that they're warm and not cold, because like when that level of neglect can definitely lead to like insecure attachment. But meeting all of their basic needs and then holding them until they are quiet or asleep or whatever is it. And like, in a way, that's good news, because it's not rocket science to raise like a normal kid. It's like, okay, just a couple of things that is kind of your basic instinct already. And then it does get more complicated when you look at like specific groups. So like low socioeconomic status versus high versus different races, you see slightly different parenting techniques, but that's the one thing they all have in common, is holding the baby to their chest and not putting it down too early.
Yeah, I wonder if that seems to work in the majority of cases, because we as a species have evolved that as a human universal.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Now, I don't want to put the cart before the horse. I'm not trying to say whether it works because we've evolved that way or we've evolved that way because it works. Order matters, and I think those are two different statements, and I'm not sure which one would take prevalence there, but I do think that there is that relation. Now, further, is that a sort of human universal because it simulates skin-to-skin oxytocin release?
So that's a great question. And I would go so far as to say this is a mammal universal. All mammals do this. All mammals cuddle their babies. Like you see this with the Harlow monkey experiment, where he, ruined a bunch of monkeys growing up because he didn't give them a real mother, and they went to their cloth mother. So the wire mother versus cloth mother experiment. And they found that comfort was the thing that they wanted, not just that this is the mother that feeds me, I'm not going to cuddle it because it's not comfortable. So I think it's even deep, like farther down our evolution than that. So before humans. And then they've looked at genetic components, and I don't know how they do this. This is beyond me, but they can tell like what type of neurochemicals you're particularly sensitive to based on your genetics. And there has not been anything that says that for sure that's the thing. That's why this matters. And that's not because that's not, it's just because, you know, they haven't found it. Who knows? So it could definitely be that. People have looked at that. I'm scrolling through one of the articles I pulled up for that exact part.
Well, because the
There
reason
we go.
it makes me think about it is because oxytocin is the neurochemical that simulates, or I should say stimulates, feelings of stability and security, connection and attachment, right?
Yeah, this just says 2022 article, mothers who showed high sensitivity to their infants, meaning when they interact with their baby, they have a lot of oxytocin, were more likely to have a securely attached child. So there's a link between the mothers, but I don't think they know about why it works for the baby. But so the mother gets joy from interacting with their baby, so they do it more, and then the child is securely attached. So from the adult side, that appears to be the case. Who knows why it makes a baby grow up differently?
Well, I would have to imagine then that those are the conditions that, all other things equal, creates the neurophysiological foundation to have that framework, to have higher levels of oxytocin when you're in parenting mode, right? Because that's the whole goal of evolution. It's not just get your genes to the next generation, it's help foster the next generation to pass their genes on again. If you can, if you have a series of traits that adds benefits over an intergenerational link, then, you know, studies have shown over time those genes become the dominant genes. It's not just from one generation to the next. It has to be intergenerational. And we do know that human beings are receptive to all kinds of olfactory, chemical, ocular signals that we're not aware of, right? A like 2% change in skin tone can make a difference in somebody's mood in the group, right? Pheromones have a big thing. We can smell hormones on each other even though we're not aware that we can consciously, right? All of those things play a factor. So if heightened oxytocin levels in mothers foster the behavior that creates more stable children, I wouldn't hesitate much to assert that creates an effect of having the child's brain do the same things.
Yeah, well, I guess it would be inferred that that works. I don't know anything. I'm realizing I have no idea how babies' brains work differently from adults, because like from children, it's basically the same, oxytocin equals, but I have no idea if their brain chemistry is different. So I was just about to say something, which would be, I have no frame of reference. I assume it's the same, but it could be completely different. I was just going to say like something just completely out my ass, like, well, I'm sure like oxytocin works for the mother, so it would work for the baby. But, you know, like babies can't see anything because their brain isn't developed enough to like have clear vision. So I have no idea what that could possibly do. And it's also known like that babies that are addicted to drugs, meaning they would have a lot of oxytocin being released in their neurons, have very, 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 very bad outcomes behaviorally, intellectually, just socially. Like it causes a lot. You know, you should never do drugs while pregnant. You also shouldn't do drugs while parenting because it's going to interfere with that oxytocin, which is the reason you get up at 2 a.m. for, you know, 3 years in a row.
It's basically a zombie phase.
Yeah. So if you start doing drugs, you will not take care of your baby anymore.
Yeah, I don't have an answer for, I don't even have a speculation for how the important neurochemicals that we typically associate with psychological health might differ in efficacy and quantity between infants, children, adolescents, and adults.
Presumably it is different because if I were to like smoke meth right now, by next week I could be completely back to normal. If a baby smokes meth one time, like that could ruin their development, and put their life on a completely different trajectory than it was on. So presumably it does have a much greater effect.
Now, is that due to underdeveloped brain areas, right? Because we know that the frontal lobe and prefrontal cortex especially don't even start their significant maturation and development until adolescence and then finalize in early adulthood, right? That's why babies struggle with executive function. That's why the terrible twos are a thing, because object permanence is just starting to be realized and they're not able to self-regulate or any of the
why
things.
They think their teachers sleep at school.
Yeah.
Like, you have a house?
But I wonder if it has something else to do with neuroplasticity, right? So if we look at it from the other direction, Roland Griffiths, the psychologist at Johns Hopkins, that runs the psychometrics lab, he's shown through his application of psilocybin, the hallucinogenic chemical in mushrooms, and PTSD patients, that a single, a high dose in a controlled environment could have anywhere from like 9 to 18 months of positive effect. Right. And so thinking that through, what he realized is that, or the hypothesis that he's generated is that, because part of what hallucinogenics do is shatter cognitive frameworks, right? Our abstract neural architecture for how we make meaning in the world. What that means then is, under supervised conditions, a healthy dose of hallucinogenic drugs induces a higher neuroplasticity, which allows the patient's attachment that caused that PTSD, right? The rigid self-defense frameworks that are built up around that source of trauma become more.
Loud noise equals danger. Loud noise equals danger.
And by inducing that plasticity, by inducing malleability in those cognitive frameworks, they can form in different ways and resolve, right?
Loud noise equals cool.
Yeah, the same way that a stroke victim's brain can rewire in order to learn how to redo tasks using different neural pathways, right? Now, what that implies is, and I think this is really cool, the way to be more psychologically healthy and younger is to, I think I said that wrong. The way to be more psychologically healthy as we get older is to induce the levels of plasticity that we had when we were younger. Right. So think of a group of like 8 or 9-year-olds out on the playground. The world is anything they want it to be. Right. They're not rigid in their frameworks. They have organic malleability with how they interact with reality and each other. And as we get older, we have through a series of social and individual and personal conditioning, we have our increasingly rigid architectures for how we relate to other people in the world. And those, by definition, constrain how we handle stressors. Over time, the more constrained we are in how we handle stressors, the less adaptive we can be to the infinite amount of possibility of stressors that we can run into in the world. Right. So the more plasticity you can have, the more adaptive you can be to the myriad of potential threats or potential stressors or anxieties that you are inevitably going to run into.
Mhm. It's the same thing, or not the same thing, but it's similar with like going in a K-hole can cure treatment-resistant depression. That makes no sense. And it makes no sense that tripping would solve anything. But when you think of like, if I click my pen, I tell my thumb like what to do. This is a twisty pen. So I tell both my thumbs what to do. And I use the same pathway to do that every single time because it knows how to reach my thumbs very quickly. There's no reason any other part of my brain should light up in order to do this task. And so it doesn't. And then when you take a hallucinogen, there's a pretty good chance, it's not for sure, but that when I tell myself to click this pen, to twist my pen, that some other neurons are going to join in, or you might even get completely new neurons to do it. And then that's the moment where that new pathway can start and you have that plasticity again. And that was something that I kind of had to learn. That feels like a discovery. It's like kind of since I grew up through academics, was that adults have no neuroplasticity or a little bit of neuroplasticity, and children have a lot. And we're finding more and more that adults have a lot of neuroplasticity as we get better at like treating trauma, and people who have half their brain removed for seizures, or people who have half their brain removed through a trauma. We can just take off their skull, scoop the bad parts out, put their skull back on, and then give them enough physical therapy and enough practice that they'll start to build new pathways to do the same things that they did before. And it's never the same. It never feels the same. They're never back to 100%. There's always that loss because it's a brand new pathway. It feels different. So all that to say, I don't know if it induces the plasticity. I think that's innate. We already have that. And then it's just giving your brain an opportunity to make that new pathway because your neurons would typically just stay asleep. And that's kind of a chicken or the egg. Like, our neurons can make new pathways. How do we make them do that? And if we can't make them do that, then they don't have neuroplasticity. So this would come down to a definition, I think.
Well, and
so
that's
never mind. I agree.
that's a catch-22 in some sense. So first of all, I'm not entirely sure that I'm saying that it would induce new neuroplasticity, at least compared to what your brain might already be capable of. More so than it actually just breaks down the barriers that limit that. Right. And
well, that's why, like, I'm thinking like a gigantic chunk of our brain is dedicated to processing visual stimuli, which is why, like, the reported, like, what happens when you trip is like you stare at your hand for half an hour, and it's the coolest thing ever. And it's the same visual stimuli that you've had around you. You're in your bedroom or whatever. I personally have never tripped, so I'm just talking from other people's experience. But so you're in your exact same environment, but you're processing those visual stimuli through new pathways, through multiple pathways at a time, and your whole brain is lit up to sort of enjoy this just visual feast that you're getting.
Which is fascinating, because what that means is we've said it multiple times, but I just feel like I need to belabor this point a little bit. What it means is while you're having those hallucinations, whatever form they might take, it's not that those hallucinations aren't real. It's that is what it feels like to use those other parts of your brain to do that task, which is wild to me, right?
Well, it's that idea that, like, every person, like, this is something that I always, like, in high school was like a fun conversation, but like, I'll show you my yellow teapot. My eye interprets this as yellow, but you might actually be seeing green, but we both learned that the name of this is yellow, right? And so, like, there's no way to really tell that all that the visual stimuli that we're getting is equal. So I see brown as a dark color, and that's how I was taught to verbally communicate what I'm seeing. But we've all been taught that level of, so what I'm trying to say is our brains could be processing the colors in the same way that other people see them. Or,
Oh yeah,
there's
yeah.
nothing new that's gotten there. You're
Well,
just able, I'm doing it the same way you're doing it now. And it's crazy to me because my yellow teapot is now kaleidoscope, and that's how you've been seeing it all along. And so it lends that possibility that our brains are functioning in completely different ways, but we've been taught to verbally communicate those ways in the same way. And then we can tell what the difference actually was.
yeah, but at least with the color thing, we do have an objective measurement with which to determine a quote unquote standard, right? So while I might see that yellow teapot as a different color, or I might have been socially taught that it's a different color, whichever might be the case, we can still measure the specific wavelength of light that's being reflected off of that object that is hitting our retinas that we're perceiving, right? Now, how we process that information is a different question, which is why I tutor a couple of my students that are also taking the AP psychology course this semester, and we're talking about disorders right now, clinical disorders.
Yay, psychopathology.
Yeah. Right. And I enjoy having those conversations, because I'm experienced and I've had a foothold either with or around basically everything they've talked about, and B, because that's exactly what we're describing to some degree as neurodivergence, right? Your brain processes information differently than mine does by virtue of you being a different person and having a different set of neurochemical and psychosocial origins, right? I think it's both of those two together. And so like it's kind of like our conversation about ADHD. I think to some degree everybody has ADHD. The question is, do you land far enough down the spectrum of symptoms that it's creates social impairment? Right. There is a mathematical average of human experience, but we all bell curve style fall along a spectrum of that average, right?
I did, when we were talking about hallucinations, my instinct was to bring up schizophrenia and be like, that's different. I have no idea, because I do a lot of research on schizophrenia because a lot of my clients have it, and nothing has ever been like a light bulb, like, oh, that makes sense. Because like with anxiety, fight or flight, that makes sense. We get where that comes from. Depression, like the lack of stimulation for your brain, that makes sense. ADHD, the processing, being able to turn your little attention flashlight, that makes sense. Schizophrenia,
well, and
so it's just something that doesn't fit in. It should be its own, like there should be psychology, and then it should be its own, like we need people on this, because we've cured a lot of different mental illnesses, but that one,
well, and because that's something that is borderline terrifying if you think about it too long, right? How, and I ask this of my students probably more times than I should. Hell, I ask this of my own kids sometimes too. How can you convince me that I'm real? Like, that's a big issue, right?
In an emergency,
yeah,
I no longer believe it.
When you have an inability to, it's like spatial disorientation of the mind, right? So spatial D is an aviation term for when you're flying through clouds or something like that, and you have no visual, vestibular, meaning your inner ear, or proprioceptive, meaning like G-force on your body, sensory information to make an accurate judgment call on whether you're sitting up, sitting down, sitting back, going forward, going backwards. You have no way to orient yourself in space at all, because you don't know what's real, right? You have no authentic cues to use to orient yourself. I have to imagine it's the same thing with schizophrenia, that inability to determine reality from non-reality to such a degree that like it's utterly crippling.
Even that symptom, I think, combined with there's a general level of confusion that is why these people can be particularly hard to work with, because they might not understand why you're there, what you're doing. If you take them to a grocery store and ask them to get cereal, like, okay, I'm going to get cereal. And then they turn around and immediately, cereal. So I better go find a captain to talk to, because they're thinking of Captain Crunch, but their brain cannot quite get that they want Captain Crunch. So now they're walking to a dock, or they're trying to find the ocean. And like, so that's one where like there is a clear line. Often there is no clear line. Like no matter what you did, you could not follow their thought process to where they end up. But that makes treatment especially difficult, because a depressed person does not get confused about treatment or why they're sick or why they feel this way, unless they actually do have psychosis, which can happen. But so there's that, just that extra level of disability. It'd be like trying to teach a dementia patient like how to do their own insulin. Like this person's going to die of their diabetes because they can't remember. And it's the same thing with schizophrenia. They need to take their meds. They need to be aware of their hallucinations and how to react to them, and to call someone when they start to feel sick again. And sometimes you just can't, because your brain is just doing its own thing. And it makes it, so to me, that's the scary part. Because there's a name for the symptom where you don't think you have schizophrenia. You've been told. There's a part where you accepted your diagnosis, and then all of a sudden that part is gone. You no longer remember it. These people are aliens. I'm not taking my meds. You guys are the government. And it
I'm
can
not
flip.
paranoid. They're just out to get me.
Yeah, and that can flip at any time. So someone who's been like perfectly healthy managing for 20 years, it can just flip. And like technically it's just called a relapse. But it never really goes away. It can just happen at any time. So for me, like someone who has hallucinations, or because there's people who've had like strokes who have visual hallucinations 24/7, but they don't have that confusion, so they can manage them, and that's fine. Even if their computer starts floating off into space and they're seeing rainbows and stars, and they're still able to walk around their house, go to the grocery store, remember what they need, unless that's been impaired by the stroke too. But you get what I'm saying. Like you can manage hallucinations, but being confused about it is the issue.
Yeah, because they're able to orient themselves enough to differentiate between what is real and what isn't.
Mm-hmm. And if you can't do that, that's when there's trouble.
It is that threshold. Yeah, let's take a break. We only got like 3 minutes left, and like that was really hot and heavy. And then when we come back, I'd like to do two things. Because we do kind of have to talk about social psychology, I guess, because this is part 3.
I brought up Harlow.
Parenting and social roles.
Mm-hmm.
And then a conversation that I had with one of my students today about the infinite variations of you that exist, and how we're not a single entity, we're a multiplicity of entities. So I was thinking a lot recently. Well, let me start here. I discovered a guy whose name escapes me right now that is doing research on world population decline.
Mm-hmm.
Which I know seems counterintuitive because we just crossed the 8 billion threshold not too long ago. But throughout a majority of the planet, birth rates are falling below replacement rates. Right. And I was listening to a couple podcasts with him where he was discussing his discovery of this and the research that he did on it, and the implications that has for a whole bunch of different things, which are a different topic that we're not going to go into here. But it got me thinking about parenting and some of the fundamental changes that a person goes through crossing that threshold. And I connected that with our social psychology topic in the sense of social roles, but not just in the sense of like we've socially constructed this set of parameters that everyone expects you to adhere to type of thing. Rather, it might be some of that, but also the fundamental metaphysical changes, the ontological changes that happen when, at a variety of different stages in our life, we go through these fundamental changes. Becoming a parent is one of those. Losing a parent is another one of those, right? Where you go through an irreversible event that fundamentally and permanently changes the way you relate to the world, right? So your ontology changes, your fundamental nature of being changes, right? It's the same idea of being ordained as a minister in the Catholic Church, right? There's this understood ontological change that you are not fundamentally the same person that you were before the event, right? And how to borrow a line of reasoning from the Stoic philosophers, that without those I don't know what to call them. Without those, just call them major life events as a placeholder for now. Without those major life events, we are never placed in a position where we have to become something more, right? So by that, I'm thinking, or my thought process behind that is, once you have a child and you are in that position, only then are you capable of seeing the requisites for the person that you need to become to fulfill that role.
Mhm.
Before crossing that threshold, there's no way to, there's not even a way to categorize it in order to see that. So like a kind of cheeky way to explain that is, and I talk about my students this way, if we don't ever have expectations for our students, then they have no idea what size shoe they're expected to fill or trying to fill. So how are they ever supposed to be able to fill that shoe?
Mhm.
If that makes sense. And I think it is precisely the fundamental and irreversible change in how we relate to the world, irrespective of social pressures, that creates the preconditions for us to have a goal to grow into. Right? Kind of like a more fundamental version of Jung's archetypes.
Mhm.
Right? That until we can define that archetype, then there's no way that we can develop the behaviors, skills, coping mechanisms, attachments, whatever necessary to embody that archetype.
To me, follow-up question, So the environment, to me, there's three factors here: environment, what you do in that environment, and then how you think. And the first thing that has to happen is that environment change. The baby is born. The baby is brought to your door from the adoption agency. The baby is there. That's number one. Behavior and mindset thinking can't change until that environmental change. And it sounds like for you, the thinking changes, then the behavior changes. Versus the baby's here, my behavior changes, and now my thinking changes as well.
Yeah, but I don't think most people are consciously aware. And I'm not saying that as in like I'm some special breed of person that is consciously aware, like I have some special knowledge or sight or gnosis or anything like that. But what I mean by that is I think a lot of that is more intuitive than explicit, right?
Right.
Right, and almost
So probably
instinctual.
that, my interpretation of that is probably the behavior changes, and then you start to think how you're behaving. I'm picking up the baby, I'm comforting it, I am a comforter.
Right, which I mean, to some degree, we know that that's how conscious behavior works. That we engage in behavior and we rationalize that behavior post hoc.
Sometimes.
Well, I think more often than not, right? So there's
Yeah,
also
there's
there's also that contemporary belief that like all philosophy is just post hoc rationalization of our own behaviors, biases, etc., etc., etc. Right?
mhm. To me, verbal behavior is still just behavior. So like your thinking is no different from what you're physically doing. But I do think that doing it physically, well, that
Yes.
doesn't make sense because a lot of
Yeah.
people are like, I am the comforter, I'm going to comfort, and they go into it already thinking that. And so
Yeah.
then the behavior matches.
But here's the thing. I think something still fundamentally had to change in order to spark that. Right.
Mhm.
So your behavior changes, which fires your neuronal pathways in a different series than otherwise. Right.
Mhm.
And just like we were talking about with hallucinogens beforehand, that variation in neuronal pathways causes a variation in thinking.
Ooh, is having a
Right.
baby like tripping?
Well, I don't know, causally linked in some capacity. Right. Induces that additional neuroplasticity with which to, in shorthand, rewire the pathways that you use to accomplish tasks, which alters the architecture and framework with which you can have thoughts.
That makes perfect sense because the flood of oxytocin, like in order to build a new pathway, you have to send signals across that pathway. And the best way to ensure that a message gets across from one nerve to another is to send a lot of chemicals in between those nerves. And the odds that some of them get there are higher the more that there are. So having the flood of oxytocin when you first see your baby, when you first hold your baby, is going to create new pathways just because that works better than having only a little bit of oxytocin to create those pathways. So it would make perfect sense that your brain is deliberately becoming more plastic. Is that the right word? Is your brain is deliberately flooding your neurons with this chemical so that these new pathways form. Um, so that you behave in this way over time, easier without even thinking, which is when you see, like moms of multiple children juggling things that moms of one children are like, how is that possible? Like, I'm good. I got
Yeah,
this like the back of my hand.
which is interesting because if we connect that to what we were talking about earlier with parents, especially mothers, receiving higher doses of oxytocin when they do skin to skin contact with their baby,
Mhm.
right? Which, for all intents and purposes, most people view as healthy for the baby because it creates secure attachment and I'm assuming floods their brain with the right cocktail of neurochemicals with which to have them develop a healthy foundation with which to grow into. But what if also the reason that happens and there's those heightened oxytocin levels in the parents, especially the mothers, is specifically to induce that neuroplasticity?
Mhm. It must be. Because we are like biologically hardwired to do this parenting thing. That's the whole point. We are walking DNA that wants to be passed on and not go back into the carbons
Yeah.
from which it came.
It's Richard
Um,
Dawkins' concept of the selfish gene.
which is fine because that's how we get to do, we've greatly overcomplicated this whole process of passing on our DNA. For some reason, there must have been, other factors at work. If it was just about the DNA, we'd still be bacteria.
Yeah, because reality is way weirder than just DNA.
For real. So like I see that, but probably not, because if that was all it was, that's all it would have been. So anyways, at the end of the day though, that is, that's what our DNA wants to do. It wants to be passed on. And we want to be passed on.
Well, and that's particularly fascinating because I forget where I read this. I really wish I could have found it in time again. But there was a study done that looked at how people engaging in new experiences and new environments causes their bodies to synthesize proteins that it had never synthesized before in response to those new environments, right? What that suggests is we have way more genetic potential hidden within our genome than what our pruned, rigid, and hyper-specific maturation process has withered down to. Which is really cool because what that suggests is, tying all this back together, it very well might be the case that transmission, or I should say transition from social role to social role to social role, right? Such as only child, oldest child, adult child, parent, literally changes you also at the molecular level too. As you engage and get placed in those new social roles, you're in a new social environment, which triggers the release of the creation and synthesis of new proteins to nourish your body in the unique requirements or constraints of that new social environment. So you are physiologically a different person as well as metaphysically and ontologically a different person too.
It makes sense because the only thing our DNA does is allow our body to make proteins from it, but very specifically the right proteins. Because if even one of those are wrong, you're toast. Not always, but most of the time, you're toast.
Which is why it's cool that DNA, and not to derail you, but this is just a quick aside, that the variation and mutations in DNA get caught and error corrected in the older sections of your DNA more often than in the newer sections, because the older sections have proven to work. So you need less variation there. In the newer sections, you can have more variation because the threat of catastrophic failure is really low.
Yeah, that's why like Down syndrome, trisomy 21 is not as bad as trisomy 3, because the
Mm-hmm.
higher up you go, and there are babies born, but like if you get genetic testing and they say trisomy 3, the odds of that baby getting like life-saving care pretty low. Like that's really sometimes just incompatible with life depending on how bad it is. Versus a baby with Down syndrome is always going to get that life-sustaining care, because not so bad, those lower proteins we don't really care about. And you can have people with trisomy sex chromosomes, and there's almost no difference between a normal person and a person, I
Mm-hmm.
use the word normal, an average person and a person with that type of DNA. Because the higher you go up, the more integral those proteins that DNA makes tends to be. So if you have deletions or additions there, it can cause issues. So that's all. I do not remember where I was going before.
No, I find it particularly fascinating that, because like, we talk about social roles and anymore nowadays in the current socio-political environment, right? We when we invoke social roles, the typical response in an audience is something like, it's really postmodern, right? Social roles are jail cells that bound the potentiality of our being, and they're by definition oppressive, which there is some truth there. If we use the definition of oppressive, that means restricts and constrains, right? In that
Mhm.
case, reality is oppressive because you are flung into the world with a certain set of pre-existing conditions that you had no say and no control over, that you just have to adhere to. So
Telling
there
me.
are, there are kernels of truth there. But as a caveat to that, maybe not a complete overturning, but the baby in the bathwater there is, if there is indeed this biological and physiological link between social roles, social environments, and I guess if you, depending on what scale of resolution you look at, we could say that causal link between biology and physiology and evolutionary success due to social roles, right?
Mhm.
Um, if most of the species gets placed in these social roles of abstract archetypes such as parenthood, adult, child, etc., 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 husband, wife, brother, right? All of these things. And that causes the synthesis of a specific set of proteins, which induces behavioral and therefore thought process changes that, on average, all other things equal, induce a, I don't I don't know if I want to use the term better, but a more complete assimilation into that role, then those social roles aren't just social constructs imposed on us by cultural inheritance or anything like that. Rather, that cultural inheritance is the result of a fundamental reality that has been intuited with valuations placed on top of.
Mhm. I think something that would be helpful for people who, well, I guess like going back, the only thing that you have to like do again to raise a child that is securely attached probably going to be fine as far as their social skills and, making friends and having like anger management, impulsivity, all of those things, is to hold them to your chest until they stop crying. And at there are times where that one need that needs to be met gets greatly complicated. And for a baby, it's very, very simple. We've been doing it. A monkey can do it, a dog can do it. Like, and, it's not rocket science to take care of a baby. If it was, we would have gone extinct a long time ago. So, the, yeah, I guess like strict adherence to something that is overly complicated and is like does include those very important things that has worked well. I think the thing to remember is that it's easier than all of that. And as long as you're doing that one thing with the child, which is being a warm, comforting presence and providing for those needs as those needs arise. And then, as a kid gets older, obviously that changes into a lot more complicated. But just to get the kid there where they're able to start making their own decisions, and that's where it starts to get complicated, is not that hard. Because you'll see that a lot with like the kid needs a father figure, like for single moms, and then for like couples who like same-sex couples who adopt a child or raise a child. Like they're good, they're going to be fine unless they're doing those, missing those key things, which all the research shows are basically it.
Yeah.
So
Caveat there, as long as they're like, so talking about the single mother thing, as long as there's still paternal involvement, studies have shown that adolescents and high schoolers that don't have consistent paternal involvement, which can be surrogated out to your stepfather or something like that, male role model, something, underperform on every measurable metric, especially the young boys. They're I'm going to butcher these numbers, so if I'm wrong, audience, don't slay me for it. 80% more likely to not finish high school, 75% or 70% more likely to engage in high-risk behavior, 60% more likely to have clinical depression and or have a criminal record. And I think a 50% higher chance of suicide attempt, but I'm even less certain about that number than the other ones. You can find all of this in Dr. Warren Farrell's book, The Boy Crisis. This one right here. He does a good job of charting all that. In short, his thesis is the boy crisis resides where the dads do not. Now, none of that is to say that there aren't great single mothers out there and that it is totally possible, right? But ask any one of those single mothers, and every single one of them would tell you it is infinitely harder by yourself, right? Now,
it's
to
not
go
meant
back,
to be done by one person.
No. In fact, all evidence shows that the two-parent household is ideal insofar as there is an ideal for raising stable children. Now, whether the constitution of those two parents doesn't seem to matter much, right? Mom, dad, mom, dad doesn't seem to matter. What does matter is that having both parents there and involved in some capacity allows modeling for the children to see effective compromise, conflict resolution, healthy interaction and play, teasing, things like that, right? So that way they can begin to map those social interactions and practice them. Because without those models to follow, they have no clue. And what tends to happen is right? So like kids that don't engage in enough rough and tumble play when they're younger don't know how to properly assess play with their peers when they're older, right? So think back to any of your high school or early college classrooms where a student was getting teased because that's what people do. And rather than teasing back or laughing it off, they respond with just a disproportionate amount of aggression or amplitude, or just have this overblown response, right? Well, what is that? That's a signal that that person wasn't socialized enough or around teasing and play enough to be able to have a good enough barometer to know what's a healthy level of play and what's a threat, right? So their amygdala just fires and responds with fight or flight to the slightest thing, even though it's not, right?
This is a great quick side note about the rough and tumble play and the way that you allow your child to interact with the world. Is, I think, one of the worst things parents are doing is putting their baby daughters in gigantic bows and big poofy dresses and uncomfortable cute shoes, and they're doing this to some baby boys too, with like jackets and polos and button ups, and to make their baby look cute, and then the baby cannot effectively play
Mm-hmm.
in those clothes. So, the t-shirt and the little stretchy pants, that's all
Oh
you
yeah,
need.
let them go.
Like having the, like, because you'll these like little Instagram babies, and then, oh, that's expensive, you can't play in that, and then babies aren't supposed to wear shoes at all. So this is just a caveat to really step it back with the baby fashion, because it is detrimental to their development
Yeah, no,
physically and then socially.
kids need to be feral for a little bit,
Yeah.
right? Because that's how they learn to not be feral.
Well, their bones
As
are so squishy, you can't put them in jeans.
yeah, well, and there is that too, because rough and tumble play has been shown to um right. So Jaak Panksepp, a Hungarian psychologist, um he did a lot of studies with rats and juvenile rats. We've talked about him before, where we talked about play and emergent morality in juvenile rats. But what he showed in other studies was that if you deprive juvenile rats of enough rough and tumble play, um, their bone density doesn't grow in to the degree that it needs to. And the juvenile males, if they were deprived enough of rough and tumble play and social interaction, they even showed signs of struggling to effectively go through courtship and mating.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's integral. How do we know how to react and interact with something external than us if we don't even understand how we react and interact to things? Right? Why do puppies, why is the old wives' tale is, if a puppy bites you, you bite it back. Well, so that way it knows that biting hurts, right? And it learns to regulate its pressure, so that way it can actually embody the difference between a play bite and an aggression bite, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now to tie all of this back to what I was saying earlier, I wasn't trying to overcomplicate per se, that new environments unlock genetic potential to synthesize new proteins to help us fulfill the requirements of that new environment, social roles thing. I think most of that is like, that's just what's actually happening behind the scenes,
Mm-hmm.
right? I'm not trying to impose that framework on top of what's happening. But I do think, like, not just with mothers and babies or parenthood or anything like that, but I'd be willing to bet money that you could go around the world and you could poll people from every single civilization and ask them what makes a good brother, what makes a good sister, what makes a good mother, and there's going to be overlap and similarities.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it is that those overlaps and similarities that aren't, obviously a lot of this, the way we value these roles and incentivize them, has elements of social constructionism in it. But I think where those things overlap are the fundamental, they might just be evolutionary spandrels, or they might be evolutionary features of those social roles, right? So, like,
Mhm.
if you went around the world and asked people from various different cultures, does a good brother hit you for no reason? Like, I'd be willing.
Maybe sometimes.
Yeah, sometimes because they tease, but like, does a good brother come in and break your arm because you were sitting in bed snoring too loudly? Right.
Yeah,
I think
there we
every
go.
single culture is going to say no, right? That
Mm,
there are limits to that. And that at least gives us a good starting point to better understand the commonalities of the human condition.
mhm.
Yeah.
I think something that is a really good example for our generation is how the social hue of a tattoo has changed over not even like 50 years, going from this is a like degenerate prison rotting, don't leave your clutch your purse if a person has tattoos,
Yeah.
to
Deliberate
now
display of
where
delinquency.
yes, like that was, you know, a huge social cue. And if you were doing different things with your life if you had tattoos versus the way that that has changed in, I would, how long? Definitely 70 years, I would say. We went from that to where we are today, where like a president could have tattoos and no one would really blink an eye unless, there's certain tattoos. But the fact that they have
Yeah.
tattoos would not be the issue.
No, the unique nature and descriptions of those tattoos would get hyper politicized and weaponized against people, but the fact that they had tattoos in general wouldn't be a stigma.
Yeah. So that's a great example of like the like specifics, the details, the icing that we put on the cake of the family structure is it highly variable and could go 1,000 different ways and be 1,000 different colors and shapes. And your cake looks like a boat, and my cake looks like a teapot, and this cake looks like a normal birthday cake. And the outcomes can be incredibly similar. And finding out what those key ingredients are, and then if you add strawberry and you just stick with your regular vanilla, and that's how you raise your family, they're going to come out probably the same, similar outcomes. They're going to be fine. And, there are ways to absolutely destroy a child if you're interested in doing that. That's very, there are ways to do it wrong, but there are 1,000 ways to do it right. And I think people get caught up on a very specific mixture of ideals and the way that it looks and the way that it's done, when you can rest easy that it's pretty simple. The base ingredients are going to be there and they're going to be the same regardless of how that family looks or operates or what, and if they are doing it wrong, call CPS. Because, those are things that happen: abuse, neglect, horrible things. But for the most part, it's fine. So I guess like the point is the way that it looks is not, a certain family looks from the outside is not what is going to make or break that child. The difference is going to be, are they not being abused? Are they not being neglected? And are their parents meeting those basic needs that they're supposed to? And most people manage that because we're supposed to do that.
Yeah, we're evolved as generalists specifically to fulfill the requirements necessary to meet those base needs. Right, and that just that makes me think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs,
Mm-hmm.
where right, so that's the it's like the food pyramid, but it's
Yeah.
psychological needs, right? So at the very top you have self-actualization, that you can embody everything that you're trying to be and do in life. And then below that is intimate relationships and self-fulfillment, and then below that is social relationships and friendships and security, and then below that is like your base biological needs of food, bathroom usage, comfort and warmth and clothing and things like that. And you can't address any of the higher tiers of that hierarchy without first having the base tiers met. Right, so as long as you're addressing and helping that new individual meet their base needs until they grow up enough to be capable of meeting their own base needs themselves, then they'll have a good opportunity to start working on those higher tiers and then grow along with it. Right, I've got a coworker who, unless it happens before then, his wife's going to get induced Wednesday with their first child.
Very exciting.
And I can see the new dad sweat all over him as he's kissing, like there's just, we don't know. There's a lot that happens with women that is instinctual.
Your body knows.
Yeah.
The woman's body knows the baby's coming. The man's body has no clue the baby's coming.
Well, and then like what to do. So like a lot of that initial skin to skin, how to nurture the baby, feed the baby, right? It might be awkward at first as you figure out how it works uniquely for you, but those instincts kick in due to hormone releases and oxytocin releases and all of that stuff. Whereas new dads, we're just like, I'll hold your hand while you push, and doctor, tell me what to do, and like I don't know what to do with my hands right now, right? And like I see it all over him, and he's a really good dude. So I've been coaching him and giving him, what general advice I could over the past couple of months as we got into it. One of the things I kept saying to him is, it's really easy to overthink your parenting, and it's really easy to convince yourself you're doing it wrong. But regardless of what other people did and what other people are doing or have done, is your baby happy? Is your baby healthy? Do they play? Are they going to the bathroom regularly? Are they sleeping somewhat regularly, right? So for the first couple of weeks, every 2 hours, blah, blah, blah. I call it the pet rock phase, right? If they're happy and healthy, do what works for you to keep you sane. Co-sleep, don't co-sleep. Formula, breastfeed. Are they happy and healthy? That's for at least the first 6 months. Yep.
Sugar eating, all that. Yeah.
For at least the first 6 months, that is what you use to determine whether you're doing it. Is that baby happy and healthy?
And that reflection, that need to reflect on what you're doing is a good sign as well. Like questioning, is this right? Is good. You should be doing that.
Yeah, no, because we all
freak out about it.
We all want a handbook, but there is no handbook. And even if it came with a handbook, like, hey, you're a new parent, here's the handbook. That handbook's only good for that child, right? Every single child needs parented differently, which is fascinating in and of itself, that the order with which we enter the world kind of predetermines the boundaries of possibility for how we interact with the world. So I had a student of mine yesterday ask me if I believe there were such things as alter egos. And it kind of stumped me for a minute.
What does that mean?
Right. At first I was like Batman alter ego, right?
Right.
But no, he was talking more like honestly psychologically. And what prompted his thought is he was talking to one of his friends, and his friend said that he just feels like a better person when he's in the gym working out. And when he's outside of that role, he doesn't feel the same way. In part, my initial response to him was twofold. Was firstly that we get endorphin releases with physical activity, right? That's why runner's high is a thing, I've never gotten it. I freaking despise running. These colors don't run, but I do enjoy.
It sounds
going.
fake. I don't believe them, but I believe them.
Yeah. But I do enjoy lifting for the same reason. Or I guess similar reasons. So there's that. Like, not only do we have endorphin releases, we feel better about ourselves when we accomplish something. Right? That's exactly what we derive self-esteem and confidence from, is accomplishing tasks. Even if that task is something as banal as picking up something heavy and putting it back down. If you lift more this week than you did last week, you feel better about yourself psychologically.
I would also suggest that entering a high school sucks.
Yes.
Walking through the front door. So there's that too.
Yeah, I remind my students all the time that high school sucks for everybody. So like, we'll get through it together. And be careful with your life choices, because you could be like me and end up back in high school. It's fun. And then the second part that I told him was, to some very real degree, we all intuitively modify our behavior to fit in the social environments that we are embedded in.
Which is good.
It is good.
It's a skill some people don't have.
And it's also a skill that can be manipulated, right? It can be pathologized just like anything else. But why is that the case? Well, because historically, right, you think 300,000 years ago, we're hunter-gatherers migrating across the African savannas, and we camp for the night. The more nested you are in the social structure, the more literal safety you have. You're with the group, right? If a pack of lions comes through to attack you, who gets eaten first? The people on the outskirts and the edges and the margins of the group, right? So that there is that evolutionarily driven neurochemical, like that's why we get serotonin releases when we do something in front of people that makes us appear competent, because we have that neurochemical association of moving up the social hierarchy. But then I thought about it more yesterday evening, and I talked to him about it again today, because upon further reflection, I had to go back and revisit and address the fact that the nature of his question presupposes that there is an original ego to have an alter of.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that's the case. I think all we are alter egos. Right. And I don't mean in some sense of like schizophrenia or schizoid personality disorder or something like that. I mean in the sense of, and this is how I explained it to him, and I'm going to use you as an example here. Are you the same person today that you were yesterday?
Mm-hmm.
The real answer to that is no. You're not. Your cells are different. You're at various different stages of metabolizing. It's a different timestamp, right? So in space-time, you're a different thing, right? That's how we would quantify and identify like subatomic particles as their location in space-time, right? That's how we can identify that they're different things. Because all of the other criteria for identifying and defining what they are the same, right? A proton is a proton is a proton is a proton. I'm certain there's some physicist somewhere that just like rolled over in his grave, because I'm certain that there's some differences that I'm uneducated to identify, but you get what I'm saying, right? Go back to chemistry class. What makes an oxygen molecule? The specific number of protons and electrons in a specific arrangement, right? So what differentiates one oxygen molecule from another oxygen molecule? Literally nothing except their timestamp in space-time, right?
Right.
So with that in mind, because that goes both ways. You're not going to be the same person tomorrow that you are today. More time has passed. You'll have new experiences. You'll be a different person, however minute. On top of that, every single person that you've had an interaction with in your life has a slightly different version of who you are in their psyche and in their experience and in their memory. And every single one of them is valid. Right? So who are you? Is there a singular entity that is Kristy Bohan? And the answer to that question is no, there's not. There's, right, we can, if it was possible, we could compile all of the infinite instantiations of you and extract out the similarities and distill a quote unquote meta Kristy. But that's not who you are. Right.
I'm now crafting a behavioral definition of who are you.
Right.
And it's convoluted.
And that's cool in a couple different ways. First of all, that what the first thing that suggests is, in order to have a stable identity, you have to be in communication with that superordinate meta Kristy as an organizer of all the various different instantiations of you, right? There has to be something with which to reduce that multiplicity down to a singularity in order to have an interaction with other people in the world. Right.
I think that also might be a response to, there must be a singular me, because changing is so hard. There must be a pull back to who I am as a person. If I wanted to suddenly become a runner, that would be a struggle. I would bounce back. It feels like you rubber band back to that solid person, which I would imagine that is the first, like, that's not true because I can't change from who I was yesterday. I'm still in my bad habits. I'm still, not a millionaire. I'm still like doing all, drugs, whatever you want to change. I'm not exercising. I'm eating poorly. I still shop at the same grocery store. So how would you factor in these like habits and these like sort of core things that feel so hard to get away from with that definition or lack of definition?
Well, and I think that's precisely my point, is that a lack of definition means a lowered ability to have a meaningful experience with reality.
Mm-hmm.
And by that, I mean, I'm trying to peel back the layers of the onion here. In one sense, what you're describing would be recognition of some of the majority conditioning that's happened to enough instantiations of the multiplicitous you that overlap significantly.
Mm-hmm.
Right. The second thing is, and this is the direction that I took this conversation with my student, is, and I'm actually impressed and proud of him. He kept up most of the way through this. Right. The contemporary cognitive scientists use the 4E consciousness model. That consciousness is enacted, extended, embodied, and embedded. And it's the combination of those 4 variables that allow us to have conscious interactions with reality. Right. So this is a can. Right. Part of how I understand this as a thing is that I am able to interact with it. It's a can to drink from precisely because I can pick it up and drink from it. If I was unable to perform that action or interact with it in that way, is it still an object to be picked up and drunk from? Well, for me, no. Right. So it is my unique embodiment that predisposes meaning onto reality, right, for me to have that experience with. Additionally, right, we have to be embedded in an environment. We have to have something to interact with in order to have in conscious interaction, right? We have to be embedded in an environment. I have to enact motion with my embodied and embedded consciousness to have that interaction. And that interaction takes time. It's extended through time, right? That's that timestamp thing we were talking about earlier. So what does that mean? Well, that means hypothetically, if there is any form of disembodied consciousness, right? So we're kind of talking about the mind-body split right now. If there is any form of disembodied consciousness, it's not any, there's no way to have a meaningful interaction as that thing, whatever that thing might be, right? And this is how I kind of explained it to my student. If we could dissolve away your 5 senses and your embodiment and the structuralism that bounds and defines a reality around you that you're embedded in, what are we left with? Well, in some very real sense, even though there might be underlying consciousness there, we're left with nothing, because there's no boundaries, there's no descriptions, there's no definitions with which to have an understanding of an experience to make meaning out of. Wow.
This is what the cognitive psychologists are doing?
Yes. Wow. The primary one that I follow, his name's John Vervaeke. He works in Toronto. And that's his big thing, is the recognizing consciousness as such, so that way we can positively affect the meaning crisis and get back to a more holistic existence, right? Holistic meaning not like some new age drink this tea and all your problems go away type of Jonestown holistic thing, but holistic in the sense of like,
you can't just take a pill to feel better.
Right. Finding meaning in the totality of existence, right? And the thing he brings up a lot is, Socrates was a warrior. He went to war. Plato was a wrestler. They weren't just fat old guys that were sitting back in a school talking about deep ideas. Part of how they had
they were like 30
to think about. Well, part of how they had these ideas to think about was because they were embodied and used their body, and that's what informed them or that's what they used as information to understand the world.
I have a follow-up question. Does this extend beyond the human animal? This whole theory, or is like the mind body thing specifically a human phenomenon? Or like, would this apply to my dog if I'm a cognitive psychologist? Because this is an area I do not dabble in. I imagine no, because that would be crazy. But maybe yes.
Well, I mean, I don't know.
Okay.
So we can play around with that idea for a little bit.
Because as a behaviorist, I am very, very, very similar to my dog, biologically, genetically, behaviorally, because dogs are extremely social and so am I. Mm-hmm. So I would say, no, I'm not particularly different from a dog. I'm not particularly different from a cow or a monkey or another human. And I imagine it's opposite, where like each human is extremely different.
Well, and see, I don't think we have an answer to that. I think all we have are hypotheses and speculations, right? Because in order to have an answer for that, we would have to be able to answer whether our brain generates consciousness or whether our brain is a conduit for consciousness. And the verdict is still out on that, right? You look at the reductionist materialists that say your brain generates consciousness, then that's offering two fundamental axiomatic presuppositions in order to make that claim. You have to assume that consciousness exists. And then you have to assume that if you arrange matter in a specific type of way, boom, the light switch turns on and you can generate consciousness, which we haven't figured out how to do yet because those are two very big assumptions.
We couldn't prove it if we did.
Right.
How do I prove my dog is conscious? I can't. I assume it is.
Whereas you have the other model that the brain is a conduit for consciousness. And, the the Occam's razor approach, right? The most explanatory value with the least amount of assumptions suggests that that one is more correct because there's only one assumption you have to make there, and that is that consciousness exists. Dr. Donald Hoffman from one of the prestigious California universities, I forget which one. It's not Berkeley. Maybe it's Irvine. I don't know. He's at one of the UCs. He has a team of mathematicians. He's a neurophysicist. And he has a team of mathematicians that has shown that they've developed mathematical proofs suggesting that given the assumption that consciousness exists, the math suggests that out of that we can generate reality. Right. So what that suggests is the underlying fabric of reality is not matter. It's consciousness. Whatever that means. I don't have any more definition.
Oh, okay.
Right. And that it is through that consciousness having interactions that we have experiences. Right. So it's like the laptop that I'm recording this on right now. If I ripped the screen off of it, it's still functioning. There's still hardware.
The computer is computering.
Right. I just have no way to interact with it meaningfully in any capacity. The interface is gone.
Right. Unplug your mouse. Now what?
Right. That's what our five senses and our brain does. It is that interface machine. It is that. It's not the operating system, but it is the screen on the computer that we use to have meaningful interactions with the operating system of reality.
All right. I wish I had more to add, but like the fundamental assumption that for me is that humans are not particularly special in any way on the planet Earth. Obviously, we've done well as a species, but also in the universe. And so like already I'm like, well, if, so I don't have much to add to that side of the conversation because in my mind, I am an animal who lives on planet Earth. And the way that I got here was because we are good at being animals. Yeah. And, so.
Well, and
that's all.
I do agree. One of the big issues that I have with like science fiction and especially movies and stuff like that is it's always really arrogant to assume that any extraterrestrial life, if there is any, would be anthropomorphic. Right. Because it's a completely different set of environmental conditions and evolution with which that biological being, if we can even define it as biological, arose and existed. Right. Just like you said, we're not necessarily special in the sense that we are sacred or anything like that, right?
Even just looking at the way planet Earth has turned out different, like a jellyfish also evolved on this planet, which is probably one of the farthest things you can get from a mammal. It's like no bones, all nervous system.
Yeah.
No. So even the amount of variety on Earth, imagine, well, Earth has a lot of very different environments, but so we have a lot of variety, but imagine another planet. You can't.
Well, and so like going back to
Focuses
the whole,
exist.
do animals have consciousness?
Mhm.
I mean, I guess to some degree, scientifically, we would have to say yes, because humans are animals. Whatever consciousness is, because it's still an incredible mystery that we have no way. Like it's all of the science exploring consciousness is psychology and evolutionary biology and neurophysiology on steroids, taking it to the theoretical realm.
Well, this is where, like, for me, it all evens out, because the logical next question is, if a chicken is conscious, how could I kill and eat a chicken? But it's because I'm also an animal who's conscious. Like, when you put everyone in that same box, then the way that we behave and interact with the world makes sense. Because if a chicken was conscious and that was something special, I probably wouldn't eat it. So that's where I'm at. I'm eating chickens. They know I'm eating them. They're afraid to die too, but I gotta eat.
If I had to place a random ass guess, I would guess that consciousness amongst the animal kingdom is a sliding scale.
Mhm.
Right? That the jellyfish, which has no brain matter to have thoughts, at least insofar as we understand them, are going to be way lower on the consciousness scale than primates and simians like us that have the most complex architecture within our brains that's been seen ever, right?
There's a lot going on there.
Yeah. Another thing I would say too is going back to your eating chicken thing example. Let's sound professional here. Going back to your chicken eating example. The other day I watched a video of a mother stork singling out the smallest chick from her clutch and flinging it out of her nest
Oh no!
to increase the survival chance of the other chicks.
Right. They always have more than they can care for, just in case.
Right. And best case scenario is that baby stork gets eaten right away.
Mhm.
Worst case scenario, it falls, gets extreme physical trauma and dies of hemorrhaging, and then gets eaten. Right, suffering for maybe even days before it passes. And that reminded me that modern conceptions of safety and security are a recent human construction.
Mhm.
They're not in the natural order of things. Right. Life
Air attacks are rare now.
right. But even then, zoom out to the cosmic scale. Galaxies are going to collide. Stars are going to explode. That's what's supposed to happen in that constant churning and regeneration and reorganization of matter in reality.
Mhm.
Now there's ways that we can be humane about these things, right? And you would have to be and in fact, there are studies that show causal links between lower empathy and increased satisfaction with causing injuries in animals to psychopathic and serial killer style psychological palettes, right?
It is a straight line.
Yes.
Because animals are animals, and so are humans. And if you can mesh those, you're a killer machine.
Those direct interactions and experiences with reduced empathy, they copy and transmit extraordinarily well, unfortunately, to different domains. But as such, I do think that we have, as a species, maybe that's too bold of a claim, as Western society, have conditioned ourselves through our affluence to kind of be like the example that I gave earlier of that student in class that didn't have enough rough and tumble play and doesn't know how to accurately gauge and therefore manage threat versus play. Right?
Mhm.
Through our affluence in Western society, we've padded so many walls and corners that every single instance of the inherent tragedy and trauma of life is seen as an exception, when in reality, that's the norm. And it is our stability and success and safety that is the exception.
Yeah. Ooh. Um, it would make sense that tragedy, well, there's like a biological and evolutionary reason why tragedy is aversive and it gets an emotional reaction. And that's because we want to avoid it, which is good. Because if you didn't care that your boat was going to crash or something, you wouldn't fix the holes. Or you wouldn't make sure that your door was locked if you were like, people get murdered every day. It's a good thing that people are like, no, this is bad, because otherwise we wouldn't be here.
But also at the same time, there is that iron sharpens iron precept.
Yes.
Takes, and I guess this ties us back into social roles. It takes that adversity of being in those new environments, having those new experiences with which to, forgive the crude terminology, but toughen you up to handle and be able to live a life in such a manner as to find meaning and value in life in spite of and despite that suffering and that inherent tragedy. Because we're all going to die. We're mortal. We all have an expiration date. We're all going to bury parents. We're all going to lose friendships. We're all going to fail a class. These are going to happen. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. And the only way to handle, or I should say, the operating under the assumption that existence is better than non-existence, that being is preferable to non-being. We can't stop those inherent tragedies. It's part of life. It's baked into the fabric of reality. What we can do is organize ourselves in such a way as to find meaning in the face of the inherent tragedy of life.
Yeah, I think that does tie back to the infant baby and the mother or the father or whoever is there. Because the attachment styles were observed through a experiment where the mother puts, and they did this with all mothers, the mother puts the baby down in a room that they've never been in before. They play a little bit and then the mother leaves and they look at what the child does. And mom leaving is scary. You don't want that. But the securely attached babies know mom's coming back. Like, this is not cool, but I'm not worried for my very existence that mom left the room. Whereas insecurely attached babies are worried that that was it. This is it. I'm going to die here. Or, the complete opposite, where I don't even care if she comes back. Why would I care if she comes back? I'm good. Which is non-attached, which is also bad. The goal is that when something bad happens, there is that trust that it's going to be fine. That person is going to come back. This is going to work out. And having that acceptance that this happened, mom is gone. And then the security that she's coming back. I'm cool. Which I think translates well to what you're talking about throughout the life, where something bad happens. What do you do? It's not something that you can avoid, but there is a healthy way to react to those things, and there's many unhealthy ways to react to those things.
Yeah, which I think is reflected if we want to tie all of this together with a pretty bow and then wrap up literally with the podcast and metaphorically with the topic and our pretty bows, with the genetic potential in the human genome and our ability to synthesize new proteins in response to environmental and social world changes, that all other things equal, if you're even remotely close to the quote unquote right way to embody those experiences and those changes, then it provides you with the physical, neurophysiological, and therefore cognitive structures to process those things in the healthier versus unhealthy ways.
Yeah.
I mean, I see that alignment there now, and it would take someone way smarter than I that's done way more research in actual science into this to explain it to me, I don't want to say convince me otherwise, but to give a strong contention. Cool.
Alrighty.